Good evening and welcome to the Washington Week Extra. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. As the war in Europe continues, President Biden says he is trying to blunt the economic effects here in the U.S. This week, inflation climbed to 7.9%, hitting a 40-year high. And economists expect that number to increase throughout March. Many Americans are feeling the quickly rising costs.
It is really killing us out here.
I mean, it's crazy. I was just talking today with my wife and with my father-in-law. It's like, I think, dollar and a half more than last week.
So many Americans can, in some ways, I think, really be familiar with their feelings. Joining me tonight to discuss this and all the anxiety out there is Sahil Kapoor, senior national political reporter for NBC News, and MJ Lee, White House correspondent for CNN. Well, thank you both for being here on set. So happy to have people in front of me that I can talk to. MJ, I want to start with you. A White House official today pointed to this Ipsos poll, and it really found that 3 in 5 Americans surveyed by this poll said 63% of them will continue to be willing to pay for more gas to support a democratic country. So that's 63% of Americans saying, yes, I will go to the pump and pay more money because to support Ukraine, essentially. But a Wall Street Journal poll shows a majority of voters, 63%, said they disapproved of President Biden's handling of rising costs. It's sort of this double-edged sword, 63% being the common number there. How does the White House sort of see this? They're pointing to one poll, but there obviously is this other poll that it's not in their favor.
Well, you know, the reality is that when gas prices are high, the easiest person for people to blame is the president. We've obviously seen the president talk a whole lot recently about the things that he hopes he can do to try to contain gas prices. But as we've talked about a lot this week, there are not very many things that he can do that can sort of make the prices come down overnight. This is not a problem that is unique to this president. Every president that has, experienced inflation, rising gas prices, those problems, it's a struggle because this is the policy issue, is that the problem is that you can't do anything overnight to make gas prices go down. I think when you talk to White House officials, and particularly those close to the president, they will consistently say they believe that gas prices is the one issue that they believe the public feels as sort of the most tangible issue, whether it's gas prices and going to the pump and seeing that prices are going up, or going to the store and seeing that grocery prices are higher. They know that this is an issue that the public understands as inflation.
Yeah, and Sahil, you wrote a story this week with the headline, and it has to be read because it was so great. Republicans cheer Russian oil ban and jeer President Biden for rising gas prices. You got to rhyme there, but that's a real issue for Democrats and for President Biden.
It is a tough one because what are they going to do? They're facing an enormous amount of pressure to dole out punishments to the extent possible. Their economic punishments and military punishments. What's better, sparking a full-scale military conflict between the U.S. and Russia, or imposing economic punishments and accepting some of the blame at home? The question is how this battle plays out politically, how the Democrats and the president frame it. Do they set expectations accordingly? Are they able to, as President Biden tried to do today, pin blame entirely on Vladimir Putin and his invasion? Or do voters end up blaming the president? I mean, the reality is voters don't always look at these things in a super nuanced way. They don't study the details of what is the president doing, what can he do, what do his opponents want to do. If they feel frustrated, they take it out on the incumbent. And that is the biggest challenge that Democrats face going into 2022.
And if I could just quickly say, I think inflation and particularly high gas prices, that's the reason that this White House is having a hard time selling some of the more positive data points that we've seen in the economy, whether it's wage growth, jobs growth, GDP growth. I think people hear those terms and it doesn't really translate to them as, oh, the economy is working well for me, because for them, their everyday experience is more defined by going to the gas pump and seeing that it costs so much more to fill up their gas tank, going to the grocery store and seeing that everything costs so much more. So it's almost impossible for this White House to tout that there has been economic progress, which there certainly has been, as long as inflation remains an issue.
Yeah. And it's a good point to think about sort of how the White House is trying to push out the good news, but having to really deal with Americans really focused on the bad news. I want to stick with you, MJ, because we talked about this being domestic challenges. We saw two vice presidents abroad this week. We saw the current vice president, Kamala Harris, doing as much as she can to talk about sort of this administration's support of NATO allies. But we also saw a former vice president, Mike Pence, on the border of Ukraine and Poland. I just want to talk a little bit about sort of what's going on there, especially when it comes to the fact that the VP is being put out by this White House and really trying to give her a voice because she's obviously had some challenges.
Well, for both vice presidents that we're talking about, these were big foreign policy trips, or they certainly wanted them to be big foreign policy trips. For this vice president, certainly foreign policy is an area where she has a little bit less experience, to put it lightly, than the president. And it was a really important test for her, right? Can she sort of rise to the moment, speak with authority, speak on behalf of the president and the American people, and really sort of make it known to the United States' allies that we are with you and we're, all doing this together. As for the former vice president, I think that maybe we should be talking about 2024 and 2024 aspirations. This is somebody who is, like many other national Republicans, sort of waiting to see what former President Donald Trump does in terms of his own 2024 decision making. But in the meantime, it seems pretty clear that there are folks out there in the Republican Party who are going to be sort of doing their own thing to make sure that their name is getting out and that they're sort of being seen on a global stage.
And Sahil, talking about 2024, President Biden's going to have to be pushing his agenda and what he got done. We saw Congress this week pass a government funding bill, but we also don't see Build Back Better. We see a deconstructed version of it. What's your reporting tell you about the president's agenda and sort of how things are going forward?
Well, firstly, I think the last 2 weeks, the sleeper story of the last 2 weeks in Washington has been that Build Back Better still has some life in it, just in a different form. Don't use the name. The White House has decided to completely rebrand it.
We're done with the name.
Done with the name, done with the, highlighting the price tag and the massive transformational stuff. They're rebranding it solely for an audience of one, Senator Joe Manchin, who opposed the House-passed version and effectively killed the previous bill. And I've spoken to Senator Manchin a bunch of times, and he's become more specific about what he's willing to support. And it turns out there's a lot of it that he's willing to support. The major hundreds of billions of dollars in tax increases on corporations and upper earners, even more than what the House passed, he's willing to support. Hundreds of billions of dollars in savings for prescription drugs, which Democrats would love to tout as a counter-inflationary measure. And he says, here's the catch. He wants to use about half of it to fight inflation and the deficit. The other half, he says, use it on anything the Democrats want that he can support, which is a lot. Clean energy, climate change, health care. The problem is Democrats are going to have to make some very difficult sacrifices on things like the child tax credit, universal pre-K, a bunch of other provisions, paid leave, that they have many Democrats strongly support. But this thing does have life, and it looks like the White House and Democratic leaders have finally started turning the gears to get this done in a way that he can support.
And talking about difficult sacrifices, COVID got stripped out of the government funding bill. It's clear the White House is not happy about that. They're very worried about how much money they have to deal with upcoming complications of this pandemic. What are you hearing from the White House about what they're going to do now that COVID money was not passed?
Well, I think it's disappointing for the White House, particularly at a moment when they are now finally ready to embrace sort of this next phase of the pandemic. For the entirety of Joe Biden's presidency so far, he has been running a country that has come under all these pandemic measures. And finally, we are at a point where people feel like, and health officials that they're consulting with feel like, yeah, we are ready to move on to sort of stage 2, where we are sort of living with the pandemic, but it isn't necessarily sort of the front page story every day. It isn't necessarily sort of, the first questions that Jen Psaki might get asked about at the White House briefing. So this idea that the money that is desperately needed to make sure that they are moving to this next stage might not be there, that is very, very disappointing for them.
And other news, domestic news, because this is sort of just a domestic fruit bowl here. The U.S. Postal Service also got some money this week. There was a big overhaul passed in Congress. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, a major reform bill for the Postal Service. It passed with the support of about 80% of lawmakers in the House and the Senate. One of those rare bipartisan things where the parties come together and do it. It makes a number of changes to the post office. So it sets mail delivery for 6 days a week. It eliminates this requirement, this unique to the Postal Service, that you have to pre-fund retiree health care benefits for 75 years, which nobody else has. It puts future retirees in Medicare to save money. The most optimistic estimates suggest that it could save up to $50 billion, although the real number could be closer to about 27 or so, depending on who you talk to. And that wasn't all. The Congress actually had a fruitful week. It was a $1.5 trillion government
You say
funding
that
bill
with
they
like,
passed.
why are we not talking about this in your voice?
Well, we are. $1.5 trillion in government funding on an omnibus deal that seemed highly doubtful just a few months ago. I made a list here. The Ukraine aid that we did discuss, the Violence Against Women Act, a bill written in the 90s by a senator named Joe Biden at the time, has been dormant for several years. It got reauthorized, sent to now President Biden's desk. And the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act passed this week, going to the president's desk. After more than 100 years and 200 years, or 200 attempts, it will, for the first time, make lynching a federal crime, going to the president's desk for signature.
All really, really big deals. One last question for you, Sahil. You had a scoop this week. We like talking about scoops here. It was on Judge Jackson, who could potentially become Justice Jackson. Talk about your scoop and what the latest is with her nomination.
59 former Justice Department officials, including some heavy hitters like former AG Loretta Lynch and a former acting AG Sally Yates, put out a letter to the top Democrat and Republican on the Judiciary Committee championing Judge Jackson's nomination for the Supreme Court. And this comes as she's making the rounds on Capitol Hill, meeting with the key senators she needs to get confirmed. Two crucial votes to watch: Senator Joe Manchin, who we just talked about, the Democrat from West Virginia, and Senator Susan Collins, the Republican from Maine. If there is any bipartisan support to be had, it starts with her. And both of them had very positive things to say after meeting with her. So far, so good for turning Judge Jackson into Justice Jackson.
Even though I said it was the last question, in some ways, I just watching MJ, thinking about the list that Sahil just laid out, the Supreme Court Justice, the White House still is like, in some ways, looking at all of this and saying, we are doing good things, but what's their plan for getting that out there, for making sure people know?
It is very, very difficult. You look at the last, 2-3 weeks, this White House and this president has been completely consumed by foreign policy and what is going on with Russia and Ukraine. It's difficult for him when he has opportunities to interact with reporters to not get asked about that, as he should be, because there is a war going on. It's difficult for White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki to not get questions, and a lot of questions at that, about the war. So yeah, it is going to be a challenge for them to talk about some of the positive accomplishments that they think that they are having, and anything else sort of on the domestic agenda, which they do feel like they need to turn to, particularly as we start getting closer to the midterms.
Well, a lot to talk to. We'll have to leave it there tonight. Thank you so much for our guests for joining us in studio and for sharing your reporting. And thank you, of course, at home for joining and watching Good Night from Washington.